Thank you very much. We're grateful to be able to be here to be the elite underwriter. I've never been described as elite in my life, so this is kind of an important moment for me. But I suppose being the elite underwriter is a little bit like being the best insurance adjuster or something. That's at least what it sounds like. But in any event, we're grateful to be here. I'd like to have the Guidehouse people in the room just raise your hands, and so we can all sort of acknowledge who they are. This is a group of folks that I'm honored to work with every day. Bright, passionate, smart, collaborative people who are really energized about making our communities better, and they're available to you at reasonable rates and flexible contract terms. So, take advantage of that wherever you can. I wanted a little bit about my background that sort of will explain kind of how I come to view these things. I've been doing consulting now for about 12 or 13 years, entirely working with cities and states. And prior to doing that, I was the CIO for the city of Chicago for about 8 years. And back at that time, we were still having arguments about whether CIOs in government should even be a thing. Like people sort of we're like, why do we need that? Why do we have that? That's not a problem anymore. There's been a lot of evolution in the role of technology in government, but certainly much has changed in terms of what's available to us as policymakers. And what I've seen sort of over the years is that what has become available to us has both created sort of unique opportunities and great challenges. And so, I recently turned 50, and you sort of realize, everybody tells me this, that once you're post 50, you basically tell the same stories over and over again and try and apply them to different things. So I'm going to do that here, so bear with me. If somebody could throw up my one and only slide. One of the things that's really interested me about being, I'm one of these people who just almost gets nauseated when people say to me that, government needs to look to business and operate as a business. Government does things entirely differently. It's not the same thing, and that sort of solution is really kind of a little bit too trite for my taste. But I think something has happened in the world in recent years that is worth us sort of marking and paying attention to, that has a lot to do with data. Our government, the government of New York City, as an example, was formed, 150 plus years ago. It was, if we were to organize government today, we would in no way do it like it's done right now. Back when government was organized, it was organized around single functions. So, you had all of a sudden people moving around, and streets needed to be created and maintained, people dumping their trash in different places, and that needed to be picked up. We needed to be able to pay for the things that we were doing, so we needed to find and collect and identify ways to do that. And so that sort of created this thing that we still have today that largely hasn't changed, where we have sort of 40 plus different agencies all operating very sort of in a very siloed fashion. We have that today. That's sort of a reality that we all live with. But when you look at sort of businesses or organizations that have sprung up in recent years, they think nothing like that at all. And sort of the classic example would be somebody like an Amazon. Amazon doesn't organize separately, but sort of go to the books area, go to the garden stuff area, go to the kids' toys area. When you go to Amazon, you log on, and it looks at you and says, oh, hey, Chris O'Brien, here's a bunch of things we might think you would like. And that's an entirely different channel structure than what even existed in retail 10 or 15 years ago. And I've thought a lot about sort of how that applies to government, and not that we ever could or even should think about organizing sort of that way, but our customers actually now think that way. They now expect a certain kind of channel delivery that we are pretty ill-equipped to deliver. So taking a step back and thinking about sort of how to apply that to our world, we have these sort of, if you were to think about sort of formulating a government today, you would sort of first start with this question of really who are our customers? Who are we serving? One of the very unique and challenging aspects of the work that we do is that, everybody is our customer. We don't get to pick and choose what lines of work we want to be in, but we can organize our delivery to them in a more efficient way. Sort of around perhaps concepts like residents, businesses, visitors, or employees. We we don't think that way at all. Here, if you're for example, if you're a resident in New York looking to get some kind of a social service, you are looked at based on the agency that you're going to get that service. You're not looked at by, sort of by you yourself as a whole person and what your broad needs might be. So thinking about sort of our groups of customers as actually unique groups of customers that have cross-departmental needs, cross-functional needs. And then sort of drilling into, okay, well, with those customers, how do we actually deliver service to them? Again, like we tend to think that somebody who might be interested in information about their property tax bill might have an entirely different sort of set of needs or a different kind of use case of somebody who might be looking to figure out how they might be able to modernize their home in order to get relief on that property tax bill. Those things are fulfilled by entirely different entities. Back to the Amazon example, when I have a 9-year-old who recently had a birthday, and he's very into these things called Beyblades. I don't know, hopefully none of you know what these things are, but it's an entire subculture of little tops that spin around and explode and all that. And they're very, very coveted, very hard to find. So when I was buying his birthday presents, I sort of needed to find these unique Beyblades. I go to Amazon, and I show up there, Chris O'Brien, oh, you read this book, you did that, maybe you're interested in that. I look for Beyblades, and I also buy him a book on Greek mythology, which he loves. That is all fulfilled. That's a toy and a book. It's all fulfilled through the same channel. In the government world, we don't fulfill through similar channels. We have fulfillment across 40-something different agencies, each individually operating. We would never do it that way if we were starting from scratch. And sort of that gets to this notion of data. Companies that organize today, that are starting up today, the most important thing they have is data. The most important thing Uber has or Amazon has is their information about me as a person and what is attached to me. What do I want? What do I need? Where do I get it? How do I pay for it? All that revolves around me. And that's an organizing construct that companies have now that's sort of critical to them. And really, in our world, our data is even more important than that. Somebody asked the question, is there too much data? Well, data just describes things, and there are just a lot of things in the world. So we could argue that maybe there's just too many things and we should have less things. But the fact of the matter is, data describe things, and that's what we need to know about and to understand. And then you have all this stuff underlying all that stuff, bridges and roads and fiber networks and all that kind of stuff that informs and provides you access to new kinds of data. So obviously, we don't necessarily think of needing to sort of reorganize all of our government to be like Amazon. But in the context of data, I think it is really useful to think about sort of why is it that the entire world of data analytics right now is created and exists basically to find stuff that we've made difficult to find. Every sort of April or so, usually the 14th when I'm getting ready to do my taxes for the next day, the people who work with me here know that I'm not the world's most organized person. So you may find that hard to believe, but it is true. So when I go to do my taxes, my whole year's filing system really comes to a head as being a giant disaster. I'm looking around for a bunch of stuff, and where's this paper and where's that paper? I have no organized construct of how to find that. So the job of me pulling that together is a real, it's a real kind of intense moment in the O'Brien household. So, that is basically the problem. Data analytics is basically fixing that problem writ large for our cities. We just don't organize stuff as well as we should. And so data analytics, probably 70% of it, is just finding stuff that's really hard to find. And the thing that has occurred to me over years of doing this is, what if we actually paid as much attention to how we organize our data as we do to buying fancy tools to go and find it? And people have earlier spoken of this sort of construct of data governance, which is a word that, a phrase that when you say it, people literally, it induces, cures insomnia. But the fact of the matter is, That's the highest leverage opportunity for all of us here. And while very, very challenging, it's also probably the least expensive. Recently, our Guidehouse team did a project here in New York on sort of analyzing the homelessness situation in New York and how to address it better. And one thing that was a real sort of aha moment to me, and maybe it shouldn't have been, was this notion that if you're a homeless person and you present yourself at a homeless shelter, many, many, many things have had to go wrong in order for you to get to that point. You didn't just all of a sudden wake up and not have a home. You probably had employment issues. You probably had healthcare issues, mental health issues. You probably had affordability, tax, perhaps even fines and fees and issues and things like that. But our system has no way of knowing that. So Chris O'Brien, as a person who sort of migrates throughout all of those different agencies, isn't known to each other. We're not able to attach information to me as I travel through that, primarily because of the way we organize. You asked a question earlier about data sharing among agencies. Well, this is really the key question. Our citizens don't really expect that we're going to just know a lot about their buildings or know a lot about the roads that they live. They expect that we're going to understand them and their needs. And that's really this concept of data sharing and sort of data as an asset is really sort of at its core a question of not how does an individual agency do that, but how do we do that as an entire enterprise? And on some level, that's a very daunting challenge. But on the other hand, maybe it's not. Like maybe if you think about if you think about flying over New York City as an example, and you look out of an airplane, it's very clear what the boundaries of New York City are. You have maps. You have that delineate the boundaries. You have parcels and blocks and buildings attached to them, and people walk over that. There really are a couple of sort of key data elements that our cities and states operate with. They're people, land, buildings, businesses, and you could probably name 3 or 4 others. But we don't actually organize our data with any hierarchy or any construct relating to that. So everybody's sort of creating that on their own, and we end up having a situation that looks very much like my filing cabinet at tax season. You can't. If you don't know that Chris O'Brien is the same Chris O'Brien who lost a job and applied for employment benefits, then are you really going to be able to deliver great service to that person or meet the needs of that person when they show up at a shelter seeking comfort for a night or for a longer period of time? So from the way I look at this notion of data is that we all have a real opportunity to do something that sadly nobody is going to really sort of think of and say, wow, that was a really great and sexy thing you did. But it's a really critical underpinning of everything that we do, which is organize our data better. It is a knowable question. It's a knowable question how data should be organized. What if the city of New York, and you're fortunate enough to have a new chief data officer, what if you actually spent several months looking and saying, okay, what is the logical construct of our data? And how does everything that we have hang off that? And as it pertains to technology, back in the day when I was a CIO and I was buying applications, you were buying the whole stack. You were buying sort of, the front end, you were buying the workflow, you were buying their data model, you were buying their servers, and you put those in one next to the other and next to the other, and they were never able to talk to each other. Well, what if we actually changed that paradigm around and said, okay, Oracle, Acela, Salesforce, this is how our data is organized. This is how our data is organized. You map to that because that's the most important thing that we have. Our data is the most important thing that we have. So what if we organized that way instead of buying an application that just tells us this is how it's done? It's that important to us that we shouldn't really leave it to sort of the whims of a decision-making process involved in picking an application, but actually being able to sit there and say, this is the data that we have. Here is how you should organize around it. So what I'm really curious about and interested to hear sort of as we go through this conversation and beyond is sort of how do we really get to this data-centered architecture? How do we actually sort of change the paradigm around from looking at buying tools and toys and and applications and all that to thinking about this is the data that we have. It's not perfect today, and it's never going to be perfect. But perfect, perfect is not necessarily we need to get. We need to get better and better and better, and that starts with organizing it and governing it in a way that makes sense and that's most effective and most useful. That's what we're really focused on as a firm. You'll find lots of firms out there who are going to sell you toys. They're going to sell you ways to manage your data and move it around, and that's good because it's important to do. But really, the question that we challenge our clients with is, okay, how do you organize your data and make it so that that process of finding answers to key questions that you have can really be about start with the foundation of knowing all the stuff that you have and how it actually relates to each other. Our applications really exist. Application tools exist to move data around. They don't exist in and of themselves. They exist as a way from moving one piece of information to another piece of information so it can tell you something that you don't already know. So what if we actually just spent as much time thinking about our data and organizing that and building our architecture around that as we do thinking about sort of what's the latest, greatest tool we can use to build out our 311? That's the challenge that I think is before us right now, and I think really what is the key most under discussed aspect of data in government, and one that I think provides the most leverage for us to make a real difference in our communities. So, boom, 0. That's all I have to say. I don't know if I'm allowed to take questions, but I would. Oh, I think yes, they're running at you with a mic in a feverish pace.
So I've come out of working in a lot of social services agencies, and one thing that every federal and state and city contract has written in is that every line manager, every frontline case manager has to do what they call case management, which means finding out from each agency what services the person has, what they need, and trying to connect them to it. This is a huge amount of work to dump on one bachelor's level, if you're lucky, 25-year-old who doesn't know about all the different services. How are you challenging the governments that you work with to address that issue?
And I mean, I think you layer on to that problem the fact that there are all kinds of rules about how you can and can't do that.
Right.
And I think that that's an important consideration. I think what we say to clients is not to necessarily solve that, not to look at that as a giant problem that has to be solved all at once, but looking at aspects of it that can be solved so that, for example, and this is a tricky one when you're talking about individual social services because of privacy considerations, but that data is gathered, and it is gathered, and probably we can assume that it's not managed in a way that sort of is most effective. And starting with organizing that one use case around the central element to it, which I would argue is the individual, and being able to build out a reasonable data model that looks not only at that agency's needs, but actually at the needs of that person more broadly. When you're looking at something like delivering social services, to actually look at the individual, however that is sort of described in a way that meets with privacy considerations, but looking at that individual, understanding that that one caseworker can't and shouldn't be the only one that's adding to that case. And that if you actually were to look at that application or tool more broadly across maybe one or two adjacent agencies to start with, you would actually be able to attach information to that that's going to be more useful to you. Because the other sort of element of that is that it's just, as you described, highly variable based on who's actually taking in that data, where they're taking it in, what the circumstances are. It's very imperfect. And I don't want to make it sound like you have to do this reorganization full scale, but the principle of it in terms of understanding in that use case, what's the data model of that, and where does it pertain beyond the boundaries of that organization, is an exercise that we're not super well equipped to do right now because of the way our projects and agencies and things like that are organized. And I think that's something that is a huge opportunity, even if you only look, as I said, at the couple of adjacent agencies that touch that. I'm getting the hook. So thank you. You've been a lovely audience. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.